Hey everybody, this is Erin from Erin's Audio Corner, and today we're going to talk center channels and why most center channels, they just kind of suck. I mean, let's be real. So in this video, I'm going to explain to you why that is, what to look for in the data and in the physical design of the speakers so you can better make a more qualified purchase for your situation, whether it be your budget, home theater needs, multiple people in a listening room, or just your seat, those kind of attributes that go along with the factors that roll up into a purchase decision. In order to help me keep my thoughts together, because there's so many places to go in this video, I have created a set of slides in PowerPoint. I know it's kind of nerdy, but trust me, it'll benefit both of us. And I have provided those to all my patrons, so my patrons can download this slide set after this video is published. And we're going to kind of step through some slides. I'm going to give you some examples and data, and I'm also going to do some sound demos of different speakers in my home theater at different listening axes, so you can understand just what the data means and just why I have an issue with so many popular center channels that are available right now. And hopefully this video will enlighten you. It'll make you more aware of what to avoid, what to buy, and in situations where maybe you just can't stretch your budget that far, things that you're going to be giving up and better be able to use the speakers that are maybe not as good as some of the other options that are available. First off, the forward. Now, this video is not intended to be a here is exactly what to buy. I'm going to be talking about a multitude of center channels that I have either purchased myself or that I was loaned from a manufacturer. And I'm not making this a shootout per se. It's really a design analysis. We're going to be talking about how speakers are designed, the faults in their designs, what to look for in the data, and how to determine what is good about a speaker or bad about a speaker, really just by looking at its basic specs, its look, and then looking at my data to determine where you're going to be making compromises. This video will run long. I'm going to edit this thing down as best I can, but I just know that it's going to be long because there's so much to get through. And I think that everything that I'm going to provide you really is critical to your understanding. While this video will be long, trust me, I am simplifying some aspects of what I'm going to talk about. If you're like me, you're much more of a gray person. You're not a white or black. You see a lot of middle ground. And when I do analysis, it's really hard for me to go off on one side or go off on the other side. There's a lot of questions I ask myself as I'm going down the middle. Those can lead to rabbit holes. I'm going to do my best to avoid those rabbit holes. And I think that you'll be glad I did. I do encourage you to come back and look at the data at your own leisure and pay attention to the data in my future reviews. I will link all the reviews for all the center channels that I'm talking about here, but I will continue to review more and more center channels so we can get a better data set and a broader feel of the center channels that are available to us as we go along. The most important question to ask yourself when you're about to purchase a center channel is, what is the purpose of the center channel? The main purpose is to be used in a home theater setting. It's not so much to be used in a stereo setting. The center channel is used to anchor dialogue at the screen in a home theater situation, or even if you just got like a living room set up with multiple speakers. You want to use a center channel to anchor that dialogue right near the center of the soundstage. Otherwise, you're depending on phantom center, and phantom center can be problematic because as soon as you go to the side of the center of that sweet spot, then the dialogue just drops off significantly in standard two-channel setups. Now, that isn't to say that center channels aren't without their own issues, which is specifically what we're going to talk about in this video. How does a center channel achieve its purpose then? Well, number one, you want good linearity. You want good tonal balance from the lowest of frequencies to the highest of frequencies. Now, certainly you don't have to play down to 20 hertz, but you want it to be playing, let's say 80 hertz, 100 hertz, or maybe as low as 200 hertz, but you want it to play linearly throughout. You don't want any hot spots or significant peaks or dips in the sound coming toward you. But you also don't want that same issue with the sound going toward the walls, because whatever hits the walls is also reflected back to you at the listening position if you're sitting in the prime spot or if you're sitting off to the side. And no matter what you hear, it's going to be the culmination of the direct sound and the reflected sound. Anytime the reflected sound is different than the direct sound significantly, then you're going to have impact on the timbre or the tonality of the sound. Another aspect you really want to look for, at least in my opinion, is you want broad horizontal dispersion. What do I mean? Well, I mean that you want the radiation pattern coming from the speaker to be the same as it is directly in front of the speaker as it is to the side of the speaker. Now, certainly the treble will fall off, and we expect that. But what we don't want is we don't want major dips and then major peaks as you go off axis of the speaker for the same reasons I just discussed. The broader the dispersion, the more you can get away with sitting further and further off to the side. But most standard center channels don't really have that luxury. SPL, I put a question mark here. The reason for that is because not everybody needs a ton of output from a center channel, and I really don't want to get into that in this particular video. I've actually recently done a video discussing the merits of 2-channel speakers versus home theater type speakers, and you can check that out. I'll throw the link up here in the card. Also throw it in the description below. Now, with that said, we're going to focus on dispersion characteristics. First off, I want to talk about the different configurations that center channels come in. Most often, center channels come in a toppled MTM, which, as you see here, is a mid-tweeter mid, but flipped on its side, like this. Another configuration is the two-way MMTMM, which is a mid or mid-woofer with a tweeter in the middle, and then another mid-woofer pairing to the side. This is a 2.5-way WMTMW, and that is mid-woofer, mid-tweeter, mid-woofer. Now, the 2.5-way, the 0.5-way, that comes because there's overlap in the frequency band of those outer woofers. That helps to increase the sensitivity, but can also be problematic as you go further off axis of the listening angles. This is a 2.5-way concentric or coaxial design with a woofer on each side and the coaxial in the center. This is a 3-way coaxial speaker with woofers on the side and a coaxial speaker in the middle. This is a 3-way WMTMW. We got 2 woofers, 1 on each side, and we've got 2 mids, and then we've got a tweeter. And then this is a 3-way WTMW. Now, this is a more standard type configuration that you would see in a 3-way design. And they're not necessarily standard in the world of center channels, but they are more standard if you're talking about configurations for tower type speakers, where you would have a tweeter at the top, a mid-range below it, and then maybe multiple woofers below that. In this case, the woofers are placed to the side. Now, the issue with most of the center channels is that the vast majority of them are the 2-way MTM type. A lot of them are oversized with duplicate drivers, meaning multiple woofers, sometimes multiple mid-ranges. And when you do that, you have more opportunity for error. Also note that more doesn't mean better. They are typically just filler in a product line, and they're often designed to match the look or the aesthetic of a speaker, but not so much the timbre. Now, this one is going to be controversial because I know a lot of people believe that just because a speaker looks similar to its maybe bookshelf or tower speaker counterparts, that it's going to sound the same. And more often than not, I find that to not be the case. What I do find is that they look very similar. They may have similar characteristics, but they really don't sound the same once you start going off axis. And that off axis really matters. So if you were to just take an anechoic response of the speaker on axis, then they may look similar. But once you put that speaker in a room and you evaluate the contribution that you have from the reflections off the sidewall, it's a totally different ball game. And I will say again that most of the time what you see, you're not going to get the same. So your center channel may look very similar to your tower speaker or your bookshelf speaker, but note that without data, you're not going to have a lot of confidence in knowing for sure that it's going to sound the same. And that's an unfortunate reality. The crux of this issue is that the spacing between these multiple woofers or multiple mids and the combination of a poor crossover design results in very poor off-axis response, causing the off-axis listeners, the people to the side of you in your home theater setting, to hear something very different than what you hear sitting directly in front of the speaker. So let's focus on that last bit. Now here I've just kind of given you an illustration. You've got your crossover, you've got your graphic to show what a crossover or an ideal set of crossovers may look like. And then you've got this graphic at the bottom with the ruler. Now, why am I showing you the ruler? Well, I'm going back to noting that the distance between multiple drivers, especially with the toppled MTM design, is really going to be problematic to the sound overall. In this case, you got about, I don't know, that's a 4-inch driver, so this obviously isn't to scale, but I would say you're looking at about, maybe that might actually be 12 inches between the two. Now, I can use math and I can tell you that at some certain frequency, you're going to have problems where those two speakers don't form the same sound field. They don't sum together properly, and they start to counteract each other. At low frequencies, they may sum together to make one mono sound, but at higher frequencies, they start to fight each other, they cancel out, and they do other ugly things. And even though they have a tweeter smack dab in the middle, that often doesn't resolve the issue because the tweeter is crossed over above the point where those two woofers on the side had their problems. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you an example using a ripple tank. Now, the ripple tank is a free tool. It's a JavaScript tool that you can go and play with online at your own leisure. I really do suggest you do that after watching this video. But I want to give you an example of what goes on when you have one mono signal, say maybe just a coaxial concentric speaker, or when you have multiple speakers, and then show you what happens when you change the frequency from low to high and or you expand the distance between those two sources. I think doing this will give you a really good idea of what I mean when I talk about comb filtering and lobing, the effects that are created between the two drive units in a speaker. For the first example, we're going to look at a single source, so a single speaker radiating out into space, just so you can kind of get a feel for what a baseline would be. I'm going to go to the right. I'm going to make sure I'm on single source, waves, sound waves, and then color scheme. I'm going to play around with that. I'm going to pick a different color scheme. I like this more. So simulation speed, I'm going to slow this down a little bit just so it's not too much to take in all at once. And the resolution, I'm going to leave there. Source frequency. So you can go low to high, and we're going to start off with low frequency. As you can see, just one sound source, you've got waves going out into space. So you can say that you would be right here as a listener. You're hearing everything pretty fine and evenly. If you've got other listeners off to the side, then they're going to hear things pretty much the same way as you do. Now let's increase the frequency to some relatively higher frequency. And you can see that the frequency is changing here from the source, and now you're at higher frequencies because the wavelengths are shorter. And then the same thing stands. If you're in the center, you hear the same thing as the people off to the sides. And this is just a mono source, and this is what you would expect. Now I've got two sources, as you can see by this drop down over here, but I've got them stacked right on top of each other. So that's where this square box is. And as we can see, it's the exact same thing. And in the real world, you're never going to have two sound sources that are stacked right on top of each other. It's just not physically possible. The closest you can come to that would be a coaxial speaker, but you're not going to have a mid stacked on top of a mid. This is just more for illustration, so you understand that when I do move the second source apart from the first source, that you do get a change, and that change is relative to the single source effect. So what we're going to do here is we're going to separate these sources a little bit. And keep in mind, we're still at a pretty low frequency, relatively speaking. And these two act as one source because the wavelength compared to the distance between the sources is long. Low frequency, long wavelength. But what happens if we increase the frequency? We get shorter wavelengths. And now we can see a pretty significant difference here, right? So the person sitting in the center and the person sitting off to the sides out here, they're going to hear about the same thing. But what happens if you're right in the middle here? You're sitting in a null. That's problematic. And as you go even higher in frequency, you have more comb filters, and then those nulls become even more distinct, and there are more of them. Let's go back to two source, low frequency, again, acting as a mono source, but let's spread them out a little bit further apart. Oh, now we see a difference here, right? Now you see that you've got some cancellations via comb filtering. So you got some side lobes going on here from each of the mono source signals. And then that is what creates a null at one of these angles, or I should say at both of these angles off to the side. And then again, if we increase the frequency, now it's vastly different. Look at the number of nulls that you have going out into the room. Many, many, many of them. And then keep in mind that this isn't even showing reflections coming back. The reflections are going to be even more problematic when you factor those in. Now that you've got an idea about what it means to have low crossover frequency versus high crossover frequency versus the distance between two drivers, like two mid-ranges or two mid-woofers, now let's talk about how that applies to the real world. So in this graphic, I've illustrated a typical home theater overhead view. I conducted a poll maybe like a month or two ago where I asked people, hey, how far do you typically sit from your screen, your center channel speaker? And the overwhelming majority, I mean, I think it was well over 80%, maybe even 90% of the people who responded by saying that they sit between about 6 to 12 feet from their center channel speaker. And based on typical seating distance off to the side, that means that your side listeners could be listening anywhere from about maybe 10 to 30 degrees, just depending on how close you are or how far away you are from the center channel. Combined with you sitting dead in front of the speaker, overall, the sound field that you really, really want to pay attention to is that 0 to 30 degree angle. And certainly you want to pay attention to what's going on past that. But as I said, I'm trying to simplify things down for the purpose of keeping this video succinct as much as I can, but also not trying to flood you by giving you too much information at one time. So purposely, I am not talking about the sidewall reflections when I'm talking about the data going forward. What I am talking about is paying attention to the radiation pattern between 0 plus or minus 30 degrees to the side. In a typical home theater setting, what do your guests, your family, your wife, your kid, your parents, your sisters, your brothers, your friends, what do they hear when they're sitting off to the side? And do you care? Well, it's going to depend on the design of the speaker. So what we're going to do is we're going to walk through some examples of how to use the data that I provide to help you understand what they hear. We're going to use a horizontal radiation pattern plot from my data. And this is something that's unique to my website that I generated with my own MATLAB script based on the Klippel spin data. This is the Klippel. This is a Klippel near-field scanner. Now, the near-field scanner measures a speaker in an non-anechoic environment, but provides you with anechoic data using some really state-of-the-art robotics and some advanced mathematics, stuff that's beyond me, way over my head. The reason that you care about that is because you really do want to isolate what the speaker is doing. Now, you may say, well, as soon as I put the speaker into my room, everything changes, so your data doesn't matter. Well, I understand the thought train there, but the fact is that that's just not entirely true. With anechoic data, you can predict how the speaker is going to sound in your room to a very alarming degree, and I've actually got a video discussing that. I'll put it up here as well. Typically above about 500 hertz, the anechoic data can predict within a dB or two what you're going to hear in just about any seated position in your room or any typical seated position in your room. And also using this data, you can better predict what your friends are going to hear when they're sitting off to the side. And that's why we use this data. Now, this is an example of my horizontal radiation. This is a bird's eye view down into the sound field of a speaker. And you can see that I've got the axes labeled back, front, left, and right. And then primarily I've got 0 degrees at the bottom, minus 30 and plus 30 to the left and right. So that would be typical seating arrangement. We're going to focus on that 0 and plus or minus 30 degree angle. And as I said before, we're not going to really talk about the sidewall reflections or any reflections that come from angles higher than that right now. Now, I've taken that sound field and I've overlaid it into the graphic that I talked about earlier because I think this may give you a better understanding or a better appreciation of what that plus or minus 30 degree angle window is going to tell you as far as the data goes. So you can see here, it's pretty straightforward. You've got the speaker as your sound source, and then you've got 0 degrees coming straight down. That would be the primary listening position, and then plus or minus 30 degrees off to the side. What you really want to pay attention to in this data is wherever the red or orange colors, the dark red, the darker orange colors are, that's where the highest intensity of sound is going to be. Any color that goes from orange to blue, So yellow or green, any color like that, that's going to be lower SPL. So let's start with the Mica MB42XC. 0 degrees, primary listening, plus or minus 30 degrees off to the side. What do you see in this data? Well, off the bat, you can see that if you're sitting off to the side, especially at the 20-degree angle, you're not going to hear it. I mean, you're sitting in a hole at around 3.5 kilohertz, or 3.2 kilohertz, I should say. But the majority of the sound pressure from about plus or minus 10 degrees is pretty good. It's right there in front of you. But once you start moving off to the side, those people sitting off to the side, they're going to be way down in level. So if we look at this red is around 87. And then if we go to this green and yellow, we're at about 75 to 78. So you're at 12 to 9 dB difference in the sound intensity as you go from directly on axis out to 30 degrees. And that's quite a huge bit of difference. The thing to note, though, is that it also occurs in the higher frequencies, so about 1.3 kilohertz to about, 5 kilohertz or so. So smack dab in the upper mid-range to the treble region is where you're going to have that really distinct difference in sound. Lower in frequency, it's not going to be as noticeable, but it is there, and it's closer to about 6 dB difference. With the Polk XT35, where you have multiple mid-ranges all overlapping, we see that null that I talked about earlier. It's the same thing as we just saw on the Mica. As you go off axis, it's a distinct drop off in sound. And now we've got the coaxial from Kef. Now look at this. See how much red there is, even out to 30 degrees, even out to 40 degrees, and some spots in frequency as much as 60 degrees. So you've got a much broader radiation pattern with this particular Kef speaker. Now we talk about the Emotiva C2 Plus. Now this is a 3-way speaker. So you would think most of the time people will say, a 3-way speaker is going to be fine. Well, that's not always the case, and this speaker shows you again why. You've got 2 mids that are overlapping, and they're going up to a higher frequency. They should have been crossed a little bit lower. We can see the detriment of that where you have some SPL drop. And again, we're talking about 6 to 12 dB, just depending on where you're looking at in terms of the frequency response area. We can also see there's nothing sent to the back of the speaker. So you have a fairly narrow radiation pattern, but it's not quite as narrow as something like the Mica that we talked about or the Polk that we just looked at. Now we're going to look at the SVS Prime Center. This may be the best speaker in terms of horizontal radiation that I have measured so far. Now, I'm not saying it's the most linear in frequency response, but again, we're talking about horizontal radiation for the purpose of this video. And look at that. You're out to plus or minus 60 easy at pretty much every frequency up until the highest. You can pretty much sit wherever you want with this speaker, and the SPL is going to be roughly the same as the person sitting directly in front of the speaker. Now, just for reference, let's look at a small bookshelf speaker. This is the Arendal 1961 bookshelf speaker, and this is very much the same as the SVS. It's not as wide, but it is even throughout the response. So you can go out to about plus or minus 40 degrees, and it's pretty much the same thing no matter where you sit. Certainly you can go out to 20 degrees and be okay, 25 degrees, 30 degrees beyond that, you do change a little bit, but it's about 3 dB in SPL, so it's not nearly as significant as what we saw previously with some of the other designs. I've done all that, I've shown you the data, but I want you to understand what I'm talking about and how it relates to sound, so let's go ahead with the sound demo. Before we do it though, let's talk about a few important notes. I measured 8 speakers and I recorded them all using binaural mics, and I measured them using the UMic 1 with the moving microphone method and pink noise in my home theater. The binaural recording was done at 2 different angles, 0 degrees and 25 degrees. I used pink noise for one reason to avoid any kind of copyright issues, but the other reason is because the difference in switching tracks is much more noticeable as opposed to me using something like talking or just something random. You can still notice it, but it is immediately noticeable, and we don't have a lot of time for this video, so I want to kind of get through the fluff and get to the punch real fast. I bandpassed the signal that you're about to hear between 300 and 3 kilohertz. Now, the reason I did that is because as you go higher in frequency, you expect the treble is going to fall off. I don't want you to pick up on that treble and get swayed by that too much. Within reason, it's okay, but the purpose of this video is really to talk about the hole in response that appears typically through the mid-range. This is the most important part about the sound demos that I need you to know. Do not use this to compare one speaker versus another. Only use this to compare 0 degrees versus 25 degrees. And why did I measure at 25 degrees? Well, The reason I measured at 25 degrees is because that's where the seat angle is for my home theater. But I don't want you to compare, one speaker versus another speaker, because these, number one, they're not level matched. And number two, that's not the purpose of this video. It's to help you understand what the sound difference is for you sitting in front of the speaker versus your buddy or your wife or whatever sitting off to the side of the speaker. It's important to understand that you're going to hear something different in some cases, and in other cases, you're not going to hear much difference, if any, at all. In the cases where you do hear something different, it's not good. Most of the time, it's really bad, because there's a distinct difference in the dialogue level in some of these poor performers. Now, I'm only going to give you a sample, but I'm going to give you some of the more standout examples, and I've chose these specifically. Also, this is not a replacement for being there. Again, I want everybody to understand that. This is really intended to be used to compare one angle versus another. Okay, moving on. Put your headphones on, go ahead and do that. Pause this video, go grab them, and then come back. First example is going to be the Mica MB42XC. This is 0 degrees, then we're going to switch to 25 degrees and then roll on through. Did you hear something different? You should have. What you should have heard is about a 5 dB difference in the lower treble region, above about 1 kilohertz. And that matters. Now let's go to the next example. What you heard there is about a 3 dB difference throughout the mid-range entirely. Now for the SVS. SVS, pretty close. There is a difference in the lower to mid-range, but the treble region is pretty much the same. Now let's switch over to the KEF. Now the KEF, very minimal difference between the two. There is some minor difference, but it's pretty minimal. Now we're going to look at the Arendal 1961 bookshelf speaker. The reason I chose this is because it's an alternative. Instead of laying down an MTM design or having a horizontal center channel, a lot of people in home theater will use an acoustically transparent screen, and they'll put speakers behind that screen. So as an example, you could use the Arendal behind the screen, or in this particular speaker, you could actually just put it below your television if you wanted to. It's small enough, but anyway. So 0 degrees. And very, very minimal difference. I mean, you're talking about 1 to 1.5 dB at the most from 0 to 25 degrees. That's pretty darn awesome. Now, for what it's worth, all of the recordings and the REW raw data are going to be available to my patrons. So patrons, pay attention for that. Generally speaking, two ways are going to be a no-go. And the reason for that is for what you've heard and what you've seen and the data. When you have an MTM design laid over like that horizontally, the difference between sitting directly in front of the speaker and sitting off to the side is pretty vast. For a 2.5-way design, that's going to be a little bit dicey. Just kind of depends on how far apart the drivers are spread and where the crossover points are. Most of the time, though, 2.5-way designs just don't quite work out great unless it's something like the KEF Q650. That's a much better design, and it's a 2.5-way design. 3-way designs are a go, no-go thing. It kind of depends. If you look at the SVS with the tweeter and then the mid-range below it and the two woofers to the side, that's a good design, and it sounds pretty much the same from seat to seat within reason. But the Emotiva is a 3-way design, and its two mids cause it to have a cancellation in the mid-band frequencies, which you heard and you saw in the results. My recommendation is, first off, look at the design. How far apart are the drivers? What is the crossover point between the drivers? And this is especially important with multi-driver designs, so multiple woofers or multiple mids, and use the data to guide you. What speakers should you use? Well, again, use the data. Consider where you're going to be sitting. Do you have multiple seats, or is it just you? What kind of output levels do you need? Are you willing to trade SPL versus linearity? What looks good and fits your home decor? And also consider that more doesn't always mean better. A lot of the stuff is going to be personal at the end of the day. You're going to use the data, hopefully, to narrow down some choices from the ones that measure well, look like they'll fit your needs. So if it's just you and you don't necessarily care about the off-axis performance, you should, but let's say for the time being that you're going to not worry about their off-axis reflections, then you may be willing to sacrifice some clarity or something like that from the other seats in order to get higher SPL. You get higher SPL through having multiple drivers, so multiple woofers or multiple mids. Then what looks good or fits your needs? You may not have the space for a tall center channel like the SVS or like the KEFs. You may have to go with something slim like the Polk XT35 that I mentioned that has multiple arrayed little mid-ranges. It's not a great design, but it may fit your needs and you may just be left with that as your choice. But do remember that just because you have multiple woofers or multiple mids doesn't mean that the design is not going to be flawed. There could very well and most likely are issues with that design. Now, if you want to talk about trading linearity versus SPL, make sure you watch the video that I discussed previously about home theater speakers and home audio speakers. I put a link up here in the card, and I'll drop one in the description below. That really goes over the factor of EQability of a speaker, and I really think that's going to come into play in this topic as well for many of you. My final suggestion is really consider where you're going to be sitting. And we talked about SPL and linearity and the looks of the speaker, but also consider where you're going to be sitting. As I said earlier, some people sit as close as 6 feet, some people sit as far as 12, some people sit 15 feet. Let's make up numbers here as an example. If you're 6 feet away from the center channel, then 3 feet off the side for your buddy who is sitting off axis, that may be 30 degrees. But if you're 12 feet away from the center channel, then 3 feet away may be 15 degrees. I'm making these numbers up off the top. I'm not going to double check. So just for what it's worth, I know some of you out there will care. I hope that the people watching this video understand it's just for illustration purpose only. But hopefully you get my point that the further you are away from the speaker, the less angle there is between you and the person sitting to the side of you. So, 0 to 10 degrees may be okay. 0 to 30 degrees may be something that you need to pay attention to if you're sitting closer to the screen or the center channel. Alternatively, you can go with a bookshelf speaker or a tower speaker. And this is really where the home theater crowd that uses acoustically transparent screens comes from. This is where they're talking about, this is why we want to use acoustically transparent screens, because you're able to use the exact same speaker across the front array, which means that you truly are timbre matched. And also you're able to get better horizontal radiation, more even response from seat to seat. You don't have to worry about sitting 3 feet over and the person next to you not being able to hear the dialogue, because that's really important. There's a lot of dialogue issues with movies of late. There's an article I read about this recently, and I'll try to remember to drop it in the description as well. But I think a lot of you have probably heard about what I'm mentioning here is newer movies, they don't have the dialogue levels quite right. So if you're sitting on axis and you've got a speaker that performs poorly off axis, everything sounds great to you, but your wife or your kid or your buddy, they may have a little bit more trouble discerning what somebody is saying on the screen. Now, luckily, we've got their mouth moving, so we can kind of figure it out. We can discern that, but you really don't want to make things even worse for somebody sitting next to you. And that's why I made this video, because I want people to understand that, number one, the data matters. Number two, you can use that data to help you make a better purchase decision. But also I want people to understand that just because a speaker looks the same as its bookshelf or its tower speaker counterparts does not mean it's going to sound the same. And many of them are very, very fundamentally flawed in design. Sitting on axis versus off axis is going to yield, as you saw in these examples, as much as 6, even some cases as much as 12 dB difference, depending on how far off axis you sit. Now, within reason, certainly some of that's expected. You're going to drop off an SPL, but you can't have a hole right through the mid-range and then the tweeter pick right back up and burn your ears, but you're unable to tell what they're actually saying in the mid-range area. That's not acceptable. So I want you to be aware of that. That's it for this video. I appreciate you hanging around this long if you did. If you want to support the channel, I've got a Patreon. You can join me at patreon.com/Erin's Audio Corner. If you want to support, but you don't want to do the Patreon thing, what I'll do is I'll drop a few generic affiliate links below. I'll do one for Audio Advice, Amazon, and I'll try to think of a few others. And if you want to go shopping for yourself and maybe pick out a speaker, because I'm not going to link to anything specific. I don't want to, the video isn't about doing a best of. If you want to go shopping for a speaker design that you're interested in and you want to help the channel out, you can use one of those affiliate links. I get anywhere from like 2 to 6%, and I use all that money to help fund what I'm doing here on this channel and on my website. I've used Patreon funds and affiliate link funds to purchase the 4 or 5 different speakers that I purchased for this video, and they were all paid for out of my pocket. Sometimes I give them away to patrons, and sometimes I sell them locally when I'm done with them. My patrons, if you don't mind, vouch for me below, because I don't want people thinking I'm making this stuff up. So anyway, that's it. Also, if you don't mind, please hit the like, hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. That would be very much appreciated, because the more people I can get interested in the technical details and the more science and the more understanding we all have, the better off we are as a community, and the more manufacturers will probably pay attention and be more willing to give us product that just doesn't look the same, but also sounds the same. And that's important. So again, I appreciate you watching and hanging around. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.